And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back. Here, the very first Friday in April of 2025. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and this is what I call my morning musings here on Now TV. I just really want to thank you for joining me. And I want to encourage you, as I have been, to please hit that like and hit that subscribe button. We are approaching very quickly, we're approaching the 9,000 subscriber mark. My goal, as I've shared with you, is to have 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2025. That would just be really thrilling to me. And more importantly, what it would mean is that even more and more people are coming to understand, or at least to be intrigued by, to be interested in the story of God's faithfulness to keep His word. More and more people coming to understand the challenge of Christ. My channel here on Now TV has been focused for over 3 years now on answering the challenge of Christ. What is that? Well, if you're new, you may not realize the challenge of Christ is very simple, very profound, very important. Jesus said, John chapter 10 verse 37, "If I do not do the works that my Father has given me, do not believe me." So if Jesus didn't do what He said He was going to do, we're not supposed to believe in Him. One of, certainly not all, but one of the most important things that He said He was going to do was to come in glory, in the glory of the Father, with His angels, in judgment, in the first century. Skeptics, atheists, agnostics, Jews, Muslims, they all say He didn't do that. He either lied or He failed. I had 2 debates with 2 different atheists last year who attempted to prove that Jesus did not keep His word. Now, if you're a person that believes in Jesus, if you're a person that believes in the Bible, it is absolutely imperative that you be able to answer this challenge, that you be able to answer the atheists and the Jew and the Muslims. Because, as I've said before, if you have not yet encountered someone who says that Jesus lied or failed in regard to His prediction to come again, you better hang on, because you're going to. Okay, so one of the ways that I have been sharing the proper understanding of biblical eschatology being the study of the last things, i.e., the coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection, it is to understand that Jesus never ever predicted that He was going to come back at the end of time out of heaven riding a literal physical cumulus cloud in a physical human body. Never said that. I know what the language sounds like when we read that language through the prism and through modern Greek Occidental eyes, or eyeglasses, if you please. But that's to read the Bible wrongly. Jesus was a Jew, a Hebrew. He was raised in the Hebrew Scriptures. He thought in Hebraic terms. And the ancient, proper Hebrew understanding of the language of the coming of the Lord on the clouds was never something literally, visibly, bodily, i.e. physically, to occur. Now, you'll have to go back and look at a lot of videos in order to get that proper understanding. What I've been doing right now, so super quick rehearsal of where we are at. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 said the resurrection, nobody doubts that 1 Corinthians 15 was Paul's magnum opus, his greatest work on the resurrection. And Paul said that resurrection would occur when Isaiah 25 verse 8, prophecy of the resurrection, would be fulfilled. Well, Isaiah 25 and verse 8 said death would be swallowed up at the time of what we call the Messianic resurrection banquet. Isaiah 25 and verse 6. The Lord said to Israel, for Israel, about Israel, on this mountain, that's Mount Zion, I shall make a great feast, a feast of wine on the lees, a feast of fat things, a feast of bone and marrow. So we have this really clear cut, really perfectly defendable connection and relationship between the Messianic banquet and the resurrection. What so many commentators do not grasp, or if they do grasp it, they don't essay it, they don't talk about it, they just basically leave it alone, or in some instances of some commentators that I have read, they try to avoid what is in the text. What is that? What is in the text is that Messianic resurrection banquet, the resurrection itself, when God would destroy the veil that was cast over all the nations, that time is undeniably posited at the time of the judgment of Old Covenant Jerusalem and the temple. Isaiah 25 verses 1 and following. I've had people challenge that and say, well, Preston, where do you get the idea that Isaiah 25, 1 to following, is about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple? Well, I'm not going to go back over all that territory. About 2 videos, perhaps 3 videos back now, I went through the context, Isaiah 24, leading into chapter 25, demonstrating beyond any doubt whatsoever that the context of this prediction was the time of the judgment of the people that dwelt in the city, that dwelt or that sat in the midst of the land. That is no other city than Old Covenant Jerusalem. This city is the city of confusion. And Isaiah chapter 29, 1 and following, undeniably identifies the city of confusion as what? Old Covenant Jerusalem. So here we have a prophecy of the resurrection, the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, at the time of the destruction of Old Covenant Israel. And so people have a tendency to say, well, okay, even if I grant that, then it didn't happen because the bodies of physically dead people didn't come out of the grave. Well, we move very quickly to Matthew chapter 8. I've gone over this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's critical. You know, they say the best way to learn is repetition, 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 repetition. Okay. Well, Matthew chapter 8, Jesus encounters a centurion from Israel who expresses tremendous faith, and Jesus says, I have not found so great a faith, no, not in all of Israel. And he says, verily I say unto you, many shall come from the east and the west, and shall sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom. This is the Messianic banquet. It's the Messianic resurrection banquet. I don't know of hardly anyone that denies that, at least denies it entirely. Okay? Now here's what's interesting. I've shared with you this repeatedly. Let me repeat it one more time. In the all-millennial world and in the post-millennial world, it is absolutely commonly held, I won't say universally, but it's certainly widely held, that what Jesus was predicting here, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sitting down in the kingdom, was fulfilled in the first century. And what they mean by that, men such as Kenneth Gentry, men such as Keith Matheson, men such as Gary DeMar, they say the Messianic wedding banquet was established in the first century with the establishment of the church going forward and fully established at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. They do not realize, seemingly, that they have surrendered the entire doctrine of resurrection. Because, remember, the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 would be the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8. But Isaiah 25 and verse 8 would be fulfilled at the time of the Messianic banquet. The Messianic banquet would be fulfilled, and here's what we want to develop even more in depth today, when the sons of the kingdom would be cast out. Now, I have had any number of people tell me, but Preston, you are completely missing the point here. This is posited at the time when the sons of the kingdom would be cast out, there shall be weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. That's at the end of time. Well, if you're an amillennialist and a postmillennialist, and if you make that argument, then you are saying that Israel will not be cast out of the kingdom until the end of time. And yet, it is absolutely fundamental in the amillennial world and even the postmillennial world to a certain extent, although they vacillate on this. But it's common in both of those paradigms that Israel was cast out in AD 70. We'll have more about that before we close today. So if you're an amillennialist and you're a postmillennialist, and you believe that Israel has been cast out and was cast out in AD 70, then you cannot make Matthew chapter 8, verse 11 to refer to some end of time. Because the Messianic resurrection banquet would be fully established when the sons of the kingdom are cast out. Okay, so what about this language of weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth? Now, before I answer that, I have to reiterate this absolutely incredible point. If you, as an amillennialist and as a postmillennialist, if you admit that Matthew chapter 8, verse 11 has been fulfilled and was fulfilled in the first century, then you are saying that the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 has been fulfilled. 1 Corinthians 15 would be the fulfillment of Isaiah 25, verse 8. Isaiah 25, verse 8 would be fulfilled at the time of the resurrection banquet of Isaiah 25, verse 6. Therefore, once again, if you admit that the Messianic resurrection banquet has been fulfilled and it's ours today, then you have tacitly admitted the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 has been fulfilled. Now, what that means is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were resurrected. But no one who believes that the Messianic resurrection banquet of Isaiah 25 was established in AD 70, none of them believe that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were physically raised up out of the literal physical dust of the earth. None of them. They believe they were taken out of Hades. Do you realize that in the ancient church, first century, second century church, there was the belief that resurrection involved coming out of Hades? That was accepted. Ignatius taught that. So anyway, let me reiterate this point. It's critical. You cannot affirm, as many postmillennialists do, as many amillennialists do, you cannot affirm that the Messianic resurrection banquet was established in the first century without affirming that the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 has been fulfilled. That destroys utterly, totally, 100% any concept of a yet future biological resurrection of the dead out of the dirt. Sorry, it's unavoidable. So, what about this issue about the weeping, wailing, and the gnashing of teeth? Doesn't that have to be an end of time? Well, point number one, the Bible nowhere predicts the end of time. Point number two, the Bible nowhere predicts the end of the Christian age. So if you're going to say that the weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth occurs at the end of the Christian age, you've got to prove that the Bible does in fact predict the end of the age, the end of this age, the end of the Christian age or the end of time. And you can't do it. Period. Point number 2, or 3, or 4. What we have to understand, ladies and gentlemen, is that this language of weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth is used in the New Testament. When Stephen was standing in the temple and he excoriated the Jews for their long history of killing the prophets, and he said, "Which of the prophets have you not slain?" And then he had the unmitigated gall to quote from Isaiah chapter 66, verse 1, "Heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. Where is the house that you will build for me?" And then he built on that and says, God does not dwell in temples made with hands. Well, he's standing within one of the most beautiful, one of the most glorious buildings in all of the ancient, and I would suggest, even to the modern day world. When they heard Stephen say, God does not dwell in temples made with hands. And by the way, even Solomon said that. 1 Kings chapter 8. The heaven of heavens cannot contain you. Where is the house that could contain you? And yet the Jews of first century evidently didn't get the memo. So when Stephen said that, they immediately took up stones to kill him. But Acts chapter 7 is really interesting. When they heard Stephen say, God does not dwell in temples made with hands, Acts chapter 7, 53, 54 and following, they gnashed on him with their teeth. Why would they do that, ladies and gentlemen? It is because that temple was the center of their world. It was the theological center of their world. E.P. Sanders in Jesus and Judaism, commenting on the Jewish attitude toward the temple, they said, or E.P. Sanders says, they believed that the temple was not merely where God dwelt. The temple was his presence. It manifested his presence. N.T. Wright says in his book, Jesus and the Victory of God, says it's extremely difficult for us today to grasp, to comprehend, to understand the Jewish concept of how important the temple was. He says, for the Jew, you didn't just go up to the temple. The temple represented heaven itself with the most holy place. So you were literally, in the Jewish mind, no, not, quote, physically, not bodily, but spiritually, you were going to heaven when you went to the temple. Folks, this is why the message of the impending fall of Jerusalem that was coming in and that came in AD 70, this is why it was such a shocking, revolutionary, radical, and for the Jews concerned, treasonous thing to say. Now, of course, it's kind of interesting, not to mention revealing. Jeremiah foretold that destruction. Oh, and what did they do to him? They tried to kill him. You see, the Jews wanted to hear nothing whatsoever about even the possibility of the destruction of that glorious edifice again after it fell in 586 BC. No wonder then the vehement, the vituperative, the violent reaction to Stephen, who said, God does not dwell in temples made with hands. And the language is, they gnashed on him with their teeth. Now, here's what you've got to catch, ladies and gentlemen. when the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC took place, what did that signify? It signified the rejection of the temple. It signified the rejection of Jerusalem and Judea and the Jews. In Jeremiah chapter 23, 34, or 43 and following, because of Jerusalem's sins, the Lord said, I will utterly cast you out of my presence. I will forsake you and cast you out of my presence. Your name shall be a hiss and a byword. What did God say he was going to do? He was going to destroy the temple. In doing so, that destruction would be the visible sign that they, as a covenant people, were now rejected. They were now forsaken. And by the way, being forsaken, according to Ezekiel chapter 37, Judah in Babylonian captivity was in the graves, in her graves. So what was she? Forsaken and dead. You know, it's interesting to me, this is a digression, but it's important. People have just condemned me 14 ways to Sunday lately because I have said and I have argued and I believe while on the cross, Jesus experienced spiritual death. Now, I do not mean by that his spirit died. I don't believe that at all. But his spiritual, relationship with God, the Father, was broken. And you know what I've had happen? Well, I've been called a false teacher, a heretic, but beside all of that, I have been accused of denying the deity of Christ. Because after all, Christ was God incarnate. So if you're going to say Christ suffered spiritual alienation from the Father, then that means that God died. No, it doesn't mean that. It means that the relationship between the Son and the Father was broken, no matter how temporarily, no matter how briefly. And look, before I came in to film this video, okay, now this video will air on April the 4th, 2025, if I've got my dates correct. But for coming in here in one Facebook discussion in which I've been called a false teacher, by the way, this individual who has been castigating me said, you just don't understand. You're just ignorant. You don't know how to make an argument. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. And he says it was not possible for Christ to experience spiritual death. Now, he's misunderstanding what I'm saying and how I'm defining spiritual death. I'm explaining spiritual death by the relationship between the Father and the Son that was severed, by the Father forsaking the Son. And again, no matter how briefly. So what does this individual do? He says, no, the only way that spiritual death can take place, it is if a person is themselves carnally minded, for to be carnally minded is death, Romans chapter 8, verse 7. No. And this individual gave the example of the scapegoat. And he said, when the high priest laid his hands on that scapegoat and imputing to that goat the sins of Israel, the goat itself was not guilty, but he was bearing the sins of the guilty. Well, that's exactly right. They couldn't offer a goat that was not perfect. Does that mean that the goat did not experience death? Perhaps this individual ought to read some Jewish history. According to Jewish tradition, that goat was taken out into the wilderness and cast off of the high cliff, killing it. But at the very least, we can say that goat substitutionarily, is that a word, was alienated from the congregation. It was cut off from the congregation. It experienced separation. It was forsaken. And so this individual went ahead to say, well, yes, did Jesus bear the sins of all mankind? Yes. Was Jesus forsaken? Yes. Did he experience spiritual death? No. Really? Well, he was cursed by God, Galatians 3:13. He bore the sins of the world in his body on the tree, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 and following. He was forsaken, but he was never separated. Wait a minute, what? If he was forsaken by the Father, then he was separated from the Father. The very word death means separation. That's what it means. And so here's this individual saying, yes, Jesus was forsaken, but he never experienced spiritual death. Folks, if he was forsaken, he was separated from the Father. If he was forsaken by the Father, separated from the Father, then he experienced spiritual alienation, spiritual forsakenness, spiritual death, relational death. Now, I've taken up almost the rest of my time here, but you have to see what's going on in Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7 demonstrates that Israel understood, Judah understood that the temple, the destruction of the temple would represent that they were being separated from God. They were being cast out of the kingdom. That's what Matthew chapter 8:11 was predicting. The sons of the kingdom shall be cast out. When were the sons of the kingdom cast out? That was symbolized by the fact that the temple fell. I am completely and totally out of time. I'll develop this more next week.